You know how everyone's talking about the economy, both here and, well, globally.
Yeah, it's definitely top of mind for a lot of people.
So for this deep dive, we're going to zoom in on two really key areas. What's going on with the economy in India and the role of the World Trade Organization, the WTO.
Exactly. We want to give listeners a quick way to get up to speed on India's financial landscape and how these big global trade rules, the WTO stuff, might actually affect things.
And the goal is clarity, right?
hmm
No getting bogged down in jargon.
Hopefully not. We'll try to keep it straightforward.
Okay, so
Mm.
to do this, we've looked at a few things. We've got reports from care ratings on Indian household debt, some analysis from the Economic Times on middle-class finances there.
Insights from Marcellus investment managers, too. And for context, we glanced at a U.S. household debt report from the New York Fed.
Right, just for comparison.
Hmm.
Plus, there's info from the Health Foundation on how debt impacts health, which is really interesting.
And a warning from the WTO itself about global trade looking a bit shaky.
And finally, focused economics explaining trade protectionism. Okay, quite a bit to cover. Let's start with India. What's the main story there right now?
Well, one big thing is that household debt is climbing. Care Ratings found it reached about 38% of India's GDP in the last financial year.
38% of GDP. So basically, families are borrowing more relative to the size of the whole economy.
Yeah, that's the gist. It shows increasing leverage among households.
Okay, what's driving that borrowing? Is it credit cards, cars?
Mostly housing, actually. The report says home loans make up over half of all the retail loans people are taking out.
Ah, okay. So buying homes is a huge part of this debt picture.
Definitely. A major investment and a major driver of that debt figure.
Makes sense. Owning a home is a big aspiration, but obviously a huge financial step. Now, we also saw something about specific pressures on the Indian middle class.
Yes, Saurabh Mukherjee from Marcellus Investment Managers highlighted three key factors really squeezing the middle class there.
Three factors, what are they?
Okay, so first, stagnant earnings, their incomes haven't really grown. Second, job losses due to automation. And third, just the general economic slowdown.
Stagnant earnings, automation impact, slower economy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like a tough mix. Let's unpack the stagnant earnings part. What does that actually mean?
Well, Mukherjee points to income tax data showing that the typical middle-class income has kind of hovered around 10.5 lakhs a year for roughly the last decade.
10 years at the same level, but prices haven't stayed the same, right? Inflation.
Exactly. That's the crucial point. When you factor in inflation, rising costs for everything, that 10.5 lakhs Wibor is significantly less than it did 10 years ago. In real terms, he argues, their purchasing power has effectively been cut in half.
Wow, halved. So even if the number in your payslip looks okay, you feel poorer because things cost so much more.
Precisely. It's a real erosion of living standards, even if the nominal figure hasn't dropped.
So if incomes aren't keeping up, what happens? How do people cope?
Well, Mukherjee suggests this is pushing the middle class towards taking on more debt, to either maintain their current lifestyle or try to improve it, or just cover rising essential costs.
Right. If your income doesn't stretch, borrowing feels like the only option sometimes.
It becomes a way to bridge that gap between stagnant wages and rising expenses or aspirations.
Yeah, that really paints a clear picture of the squeeze. Okay, now for that comparison point, the U.S., what did the Federal Reserve Bank of New York find about household debt there?
Well, the numbers are pretty staggering. Total household debt in the U.S. hit $17.5 trillion in the first quarter of this year.
$17.5 trillion. That's hard to even comprehend, and that was an increase.
Yep, up by $184 billion from just the previous quarter, a 1.1% jump.
And what makes up that debt? Is it mostly mortgages like in India?
Mortgages are definitely the biggest chunk, yeah. $12.25 trillion. But then you've got significant amounts in student loans, $1.61 trillion, and auto loans, $1.62 trillion.
Okay, so mortgages dominate, but student and auto loans are substantial too. What about credit cards?
Credit card balances were at $1.12 trillion. And interestingly, they actually increased by $26 billion in that first quarter.
So people are using their credit cards more too. How are they managing these payments in the U.S.? Any signs of trouble?
The report looked at delinquency rates, people falling behind. Overall, the rate ticked up slightly to 3.2% in March.
Slightly higher.
Oh.
But how does that compare historically?
It's actually still lower than before the pandemic, back in 2019. So a slight increase, but not at alarming levels compared to recent history.
Okay.
Though they did note that the rates for people transitioning into delinquency specifically for credit cards and auto loans did increase a bit more noticeably.
Got it. So maybe a little pressure building on credit card and car payments, but overall delinquency is still below pre-pandemic levels. It's useful context. Now let's shift gears slightly. There was that report linking debt and health. That sounds really important.
It really is. This was from the Health Foundation, and they found a pretty strong connection. People who are in what they call problem debt, really struggling to manage it, are about 3 times more likely to report being in poor health.
3 times more likely.
Yeah.
That's a very stark statistic. What's the reason? How does debt actually affect health?
There seem to be a few mechanisms at play. First, if you're deep in debt, you might cut back on spending on things that are actually good for your health, like nutritious food, gym memberships, preventative care, that sort of thing.
Okay, so less money for healthy choices. Makes sense.
Then there's the sheer stress, constantly worrying about bills, about making payments. That takes a huge toll on both mental and physical health.
Absolutely. Chronic stress is terrible for you.
And sometimes people might fall into unhealthy coping behaviors, maybe smoking more, drinking more, poor diet, just trying to deal with the pressure.
It sounds like a vicious cycle. Debt causes stress, stress harms health, and poor health can make it even harder to earn money and get out of debt.
Exactly. And the report points out that the current cost of living crisis, with high prices for essentials like food and energy, plus rising interest rates making debt more expensive, well, that risks making everything worse.
So it exacerbates the problem.
Right. And it hits lower income households the hardest because they usually have fewer savings to fall back on, and debt payments eat up a much bigger slice of their income. This could really widen health inequalities.
That's a really sobering point. It's not just numbers on a spreadsheet, it's people's actual well-being. Okay, let's move to the global stage now. The World Trade Organization, the WTO. What was that warning about global trade?
Yeah, the WTO recently came out saying the outlook for global trade has, and this is their phrase, deteriorated sharply.
Deteriorated sharply. That sounds serious. What's causing this pessimism?
They linked it directly to uncertainty, especially surrounding tariffs, those taxes on imported goods. Trade policies are just feeling less predictable right now.
Right. So this uncertainty about tariffs and trade rules is making the whole global trade picture look worse. How might that impact a country like India?
Well, if the global trade environment weakens, it creates headwinds for any economy involved in international trade. For India, which has significant export sectors, a global slowdown or increased trade friction could mean less demand for its goods and services.
So if other countries are buying less, or if it becomes harder to sell to them because of tariffs.
It can definitely dampen India's economic growth prospects. It affects those export-reliant industries and the jobs they provide.
Okay. And to understand this tariff issue better, we looked at trade protectionism. Can you break that down for us? What is it?
Sure. Focus Economics explains it pretty simply. Trade protectionism is basically governments putting policies in place to try and shield their own domestic producers from foreign competition.
Shielding local businesses. How do they do that? What are the tools?
Tariffs are the classic tool. Like we said, taxes on imports, they make foreign goods more expensive, hoping consumers will buy domestic alternatives instead.
Okay, taxes on imports. Are there different kinds?
Yeah, you have specific tariffs, like a fixed fee, say $5 on every imported pair of shoes, and ad valorem tariffs, which are a percentage of the import's value, like a 10% tax on imported cars.
Got it. Tariffs make imports pricier.
What else? Quotas are another one. These are straight-up limits on the quantity of a certain good that can be imported. Focus Economics mentioned China uses these for things like wheat and rice.
So limiting how much can even come into the country.
Exactly. And then there are subsidies. This is where the government gives financial help to domestic industries.
How does that help them compete with imports?
It lowers their production costs. So maybe direct payments, tax breaks. It makes their products cheaper to produce and therefore more competitive against foreign goods, both at home and maybe even for export. The EU's Common Agricultural Policy, KP, with its farmer subsidies is a big example.
Right, the CAP. So tariffs, quotas, subsidies, all aimed at protecting local industries.
That's the main goal, yes. Protecting them from potentially cheaper foreign competitors, encouraging local investment, maybe preserving jobs in those sectors.
It sounds like it could have benefits then, protecting local jobs. But are there downsides?
Oh, definitely. A major risk is retaliation. If country A puts tariffs on country B's goods.
Country B might hit back with its own tariffs.
Precisely. And that can escalate into a trade war, like we saw hints of between the U.S. and China. That disrupts supply chains, makes things more expensive for everyone, and can slow down the whole global economy.
So trade wars are a big risk. Anything else?
Yeah, another concern is efficiency and innovation. If domestic industries are too protected from foreign competition.
They might get complacent.
Sort of, yeah. Less pressure to become more efficient, to innovate, to keep prices low. It can actually lead to less dynamism in the long run and potentially higher prices for consumers than they'd otherwise pay.
Okay, so it's a trade-off. Protection might help some local producers, but could lead to retaliation and make the protected industries less competitive over time.
It's a complex balancing act. And sometimes measures are framed differently, like China's strict food safety rules for imports could be seen partly as protectionism, even if safety is also a valid concern.
Right, it's not always clear-cut.
Yeah.
So bringing this all back together for India, how does this potentially shaky global trade outlook, maybe with more protectionism, interact with the domestic situation of rising household debt we talked about earlier?
Well, it could create a kind of double pressure. If India's export growth slows because of global trade issues, that impacts national income and job creation.
Which could make it harder for people already stretched financially.
Exactly. If the broader economy slows due to trade headwinds, it could make it even tougher for households, especially the middle class dealing with that stagnant income and rising debt, to manage their finances. External challenges could amplify domestic financial stress.
It seems like these two issues, domestic debt and global trade uncertainty, could really compound each other.
They certainly could. While, some might argue for selective protectionism to boost local manufacturing in India, the potential downsides, retaliation, reduced efficiency, the impact on export sectors have to be weighed very carefully, especially given the existing financial pressures on households.
It's a really interconnected picture. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways listeners should hold on to?
Okay, I think three main things. First, in India, household debt is rising, driven largely by home loans, and this is happening alongside significant financial strain on the middle class due to stagnant real incomes.
Right. Debt up, middle class squeezed. What's second?
Second, the global trade outlook is looking gloomier. The WTO's warning about deterioration linked to tariff uncertainty and protectionism is a potential headwind for India's economy.
Okay, global trade uncertainty. And third,
Third, remember the link between debt and health. Being in problem debt isn't just a financial issue, it has real, serious consequences for people's physical and mental well-being.
debt, trade, health, all interconnected. So maybe a final thought for people to mull over.
Well, when you put it all together, rising debt at home, a potentially tougher trading world outside, it really makes you wonder what kind of innovative solutions or policy shifts might India need?
To ensure financial stability and well-being for its citizens, while also navigating these tricky global economic currents.
Exactly. How do you manage both the internal pressures and the external challenges simultaneously? It's a complex puzzle.
Definitely something to think about, that intersection of local finance and global forces. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.